we're not asking for change. Uh, we're not asking people, this is not the psychological role, would be to change things. That's a different role. Psychologically, we're just here to really create a space for an unfolding, uh, a place for healing to happen. I mean, in terms of like at large, cultures shifting and changing. Um, I think, maybe an example of a kind of transformation in a culture would be in South Africa, when um, the way that culture transcended its past, I think is an interesting example, but these are very rare. Um, I think in, post-Nazi Germany, there was really an effort to transform the culture. Um, but usually what I've noticed is it tends to it really tends to happen on a very personal level.
Yeah, it is trickier with cultures because, at least from how I've viewed it, is that like even when these transformations are happening in a culture after something devastating and catastrophic, like there are still things that linger. And again, it brings me back to like the work of Sam Kimball's talking about phantom narratives and how these like phantoms kind of continue to exist in like the cultural psyche and can be transmitted from generation to generation, and like seeing it on an individual level, like when we talk about intergenerational trauma and like feelings or things that people are carrying and not really knowing why or where they come from. And sometimes, you come to therapy and you start exploring family history and you start seeing patterns either in like emotions or behaviors or experiences, and you can't help but wonder, if this is something that I'm carrying from my own experiences, or is it something that I've kind of in some way inherited or kind of been passed down. And so it's like, well, if that's the case, if like these phantom narratives continue to exist, then, how does forgiveness happen on a cultural level? Because it seems like if they're passed down and carried, then the culture as a whole isn't experiencing that kind of freedom or relief from carrying the burden of these things. And yet at the same time, it's kind of like, well, I don't know. I guess what I'm thinking of now is like, is it is it hard to kind of let go of those because in some way they form a collective identity? Do the burdens kind of form a collective identity in some way?
Yeah, when I wrote about family lineage and the neurotic soul, as I think you mentioned it, Dr. Sandoval Giger talks about the neurotic soul, a sort of behavior that came from a break between a great grandfather and a grandfather and just went through the family, especially the males in the family. And I talk about um, how our culture, they do have an identity and they stick with it. And it's my hope that we can, through education, break free from these cultural norms that I feel can be very negative to, say, like the Latino population. Like everyone talks about La Chancla, and we all like have a good laugh about it. But like, do we really need to talk about that? Can we change that? I that's I don't know if you're going that way, Karina, but like it made me think of that. It made me think of how yeah, we do carry these cultural identities and we're going to hold on to them because, my identity and you're not going to take that away from me, even though it's a negative one. It's like to me, that goes back to what I was saying, that we're still in the fight phase, in the pushing back phase, not in the, forgiveness, open up, curiosity, you know, um, for me, when it comes to culture, I still think we have a long ways to educate and to really change people's minds, you know, on how we should behave. Um, and then when on a personal level, when it comes to forgiveness on a personal level, like say I have an issue with my mother because she did the la chancla on me, um, I have to see her for who she is. A 12-year-old still inside who was also given La Chancla by her mother, who was given it to her by, her, and it's just like, and so that was what I was speaking of the internal, I have to work on it internally before I'm able to see my mother for who she is and what she went through. But that takes years. It took a lot of years for me personally, and on a broader, with culture, I'm going to go back to Latino culture. With that culture, it's like there are some norms that we have that I wish we can break free from because I think they're very negative. I think that they hurt us more than help us, and um, in that case, forgiveness on a personal level becomes education on a larger scale. That's how I'm connecting the two.
Yeah, it feels like sometimes the like struggling to forgive can be a sign that it's something that you really care about, and that can kind of point you in the direction of your values. Like when we're talking about the injustice stuff, like I know Dr. Sandoval shared that quote about if you want a good relationship, you should have a bad memory, but it seems like there are some things that you want a good memory for and you want to remember so that it doesn't happen again. And if we can maybe listen to that part of ourselves that is saying, I don't want to forgive this person. I don't want to forgive this system or this event or this past version of myself. Maybe there's an important reason why you're not able to forgive them. And maybe that's because it's something that needs to be changed. And we talked about that a little bit before, but linking this back into what Jack was saying, I think it would be really powerful, both on an individual level and also societal, to find a different way to remember and honor our traumas that will release us from the feeling like we have to hang on to them. Like if we can find a different way to remember them other than the hatred we feel for this person that wronged us or the hatred we feel towards the system, then we can still reach that place of action and make it different. But in the meantime, I think it's really important to listen to why am I having such a hard time forgiving this,
That prompted me to think like how can we um, uh, honor, like you said, Megan, honor our traumas from a soul position rather than from the ego
Exactly, yeah.
position. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that anything it this is in a way that the real difficulty of discussing forgiveness, because forgiveness can feel like a threat, like it's asking us to not pay attention to injuries,
Yeah.
or that it's asking us to not take action or make changes or that kind of thing. That it's asking us to just sort of let it be okay or let it slide, or you know not judge it, so that, and if I don't judge it, well then it's just going to happen again. And I think this is why we don't ask, we're never asked, and I would kind of push up against what you said, Jack. We're not asking for change. uh we're not asking people, this is not the psychological role, would be to change things. That's a different role. Psychologically, we're just here to really create a space for an unfolding, a place for healing to happen, if it's going to happen. I mean, it may not. They may not be ready. Kind of like to what Megan was saying. Sometimes it's not you. You have to be present for your life, for what's happening, right? Like that's what we would want to support people in, that whatever experience they're going through. It's just that there comes a moment, there comes a time, I think, when the pain becomes so unbearable. It's like we're on our knees saying there must be a better way to relate to this pain, to relate to what's happening to me. And that's when I think true forgiveness begins to emerge as a possibility, where we are not the same person that went through that trauma. Once forgiveness happens, you have a completely different perspective on your own past. And it's like front of the hand, back of the hand. And it's almost like, to truly understand it, you have to have already done it. It has to already have happened in your mind to go, oh my God, that's what I see now. But this is something that, in a lot of ways, we're in our egos trying to grasp something that's a non-ego phenomenon. And to the ego, though, it can feel threatening or not available, or it's the ego distorts what the possibility is, and it makes forgiveness into something that would be actually weaker, like letting bad behavior slide, or not being effective or powerful in the moment. Saying I have to remember those things, otherwise it's going to happen again. That would be the ego sees forgiveness as a threat to its reality. So this is why we don't say it's any kind of prescription, that we may be very tempted, right? Like, oh man, look at how it could be if we were different, if we didn't have the chanclas anymore happening, right? Except that it is happening. And so how can we relate to reality in an undistorted way and still hold the possibility of forgiveness, even though the ego cannot fathom it? This is such a difficult topic, because of that very threat. If you ask me to forgive, I'm going to lose my power. That's kind of how the logic of it goes, which makes a ton of sense. And I think it would, if we ask someone to forgive, kind of like to Megan's point, and that's not how they were feeling, that would really go against their own process, and it would dishonor their own experience and would steal strength from them. So this is why it is really a challenging topic, psychologically.
It's a lot of tension to be held.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe to be continued, like this is, it feels like we sort of have to hash out different scenarios. I appreciate the conversation, the cultural ideas that came up, the ideas around trauma and how to handle that, and what role does forgiveness play with trauma? I think the idea of like trying to change people or educate people, that kind of thing, it's a real pitfall for us, because I think we all have a complex of, healers we're going to save. That's why we're even in this profession. And that tension, right? Holding that tension.